So now we're going to add the methods that we need to either add a user into the cache or remove a user into the cache and check to see if they have exceeded how many times, the number of times that they are allowed to try to log in. So again, just to recap, this from line 16 to line 24, all we're doing here is just initializing the actual cache. As you can see, the loading cache coming from Guava. So that's the way you initialize it. So technically you set the type that you're going to have in your actual map, and then you call the cache builder, and then you pass in the number of time that you want the cache to expire after, and then you pass in the size you want. And then in this case, we're putting 100, meaning at any given time, we will have 100 entries in the actual cache. So let's go down here, and then let's do public void, because this is not going to return anything. And let's call this method evict user from login attempt cache. Okay, so this is gonna take a string, which is gonna be the username, and what we have to do here, let me see if I can scroll up a little bit. Okay, so what we have to do here is to just add the validate the user from the cache, meaning we're gonna remove the user from the actual cache. So all we have to do now, we just have to call the login attempt cache, and then we're gonna call the invalidate, and then we're gonna pass in the username. Okay, so that's gonna find this key and then remove the value. So technically just removing this actual value altogether. So when I call this evict user from login attempt cache, if the username is for this user, so it's gonna go ahead and just remove it just like that. It's gonna remove it because it's gonna try to find the actual key, which is gonna be the username, and then it's gonna remove the entry altogether. So that's what this method is doing. So next we need another method that's gonna actually add the user to the actual cache. So let's do public, and that's also gonna return void, and let's call it add user to login attempt cache, because that's what this method is doing. And of course this one is going to take a username, and what we have to do now is to just increment their value and then put them in the cache. Okay, so let's define a local variable. Let's call it attempts. So this is gonna initially be equals to 0, because we don't know if they have any attempts yet or anything like that. So initially we set it to 0, and then we're gonna try create a try catch block. So try, and we're gonna do catch here, and then what we want to do here is to set this attempt to whatever we have in the actual cache plus the increment. So we're gonna go up here and then say, hey, I'm gonna add this user to the cache. So the number of attempt that they're gonna have when they're added to the cache is gonna be the increment. So we're gonna add 1 to whatever they already have. So if they had 0, then it's gonna turn into 1. Okay, so if they had 1, then it's gonna be 2, and so on and so forth. So here we're gonna take the increment, which in this case is just 1, and then we're gonna add the whatever we already have for that user. So here we're gonna call the login attempt cache, and then we're gonna see if we can get the user. So in the get, we're gonna pass in the actual username. So what this is gonna do is it's gonna see if you can find a value for this key. So if you remember, if we go back here, we're gonna give it this username, and it's gonna return the number of attempt. So whatever the attempt is, we're adding 1 to it. So when we have the total number of attempt, in this case, which is going to be this number right here, we can actually put them in the actual login cache. So let's go and call the login, and then we're going to do put, and then we're going to give the username, which is the key, and then the value, which is going to be the number of attempt. Okay, so we add them to the cache. But as you can see, before we do that, we make sure that we increment their attempt. Okay, so if initially it's the first time that we adding them into the cache, then it's going to be from 0, because they don't have any attempts yet. It's going to go from 0 to 1, and then from there from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 2 to 4, 5, until we stop them from logging in. So again, just to recap, I'm just adding a user to the cache, which is happening here on line 36. But before I do that, I add 1 to the number of attempts. So I grab their, I pass in the key, which is this, the actual user, which is in this case is their username. So when I call get and pass in the username, it's going to return this number right here, which is the maximum number of attempts that they've tried already. They have that in the cache, and you know the cache has been running for 15 minutes. Okay, so within this period of 15 minutes, I'm checking to see how many times they try to log in. Okay, and then once I get this number, I add them into the cache here by adding the username and the actual number of attempts. Okay, and then lastly, we need to be able to check to see if they have exceeded the number of attempts that they're allowed to. So this is going to return a Boolean, and we're going to call it as exceeded max attempt. Okay, so let's just call it that. And of course, it's going to take the username because that's our key. That's how we find someone in the actual cache. And then here, all we have to do is to just return the login attempt. And then we're gonna see if we can get this entry in the cache. So we're gonna call get, and then we're gonna pass in the username. So when we call get, just like we do here, and pass in the username, it's gonna return this number right here. Okay, so the number of times they try to log in already. So once we have that number, we just have to make sure that it doesn't, it's not bigger or equal the number of max attempt that we define here, which is in this case is fine. So we're gonna come down here and then say as long as this is not bigger, equal or bigger than this number right here, which is 5. Okay, so this is gonna return true or false if they have exceeded this number of attempt or not, or if it's equal 5. As you can see, I'm doing greater and equal. Okay, oops. And then here we also have to add this exception. Well, actually, that should be fine. So instead of doing all of this catch here, we can actually throw the exception like this. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna come here and throw the exception, and then I won't need this catch anymore. So from here, I can just remove all this. Okay, make it a little bit more cleaner. And of course, I don't need this, and I don't need this. Okay, so that's gonna do the trick for us. I need to align this real quick. Okay, so this is everything we pretty much need to just build this whole functionality for the actual login attempt. So we'll show you how this is going to be working. Right now it's a little bit abstract, and because you're not really seeing it in action. But again, I'm gonna recap just one last time, just so you better understand. So we're gonna create a service which is technically gonna be a cache. Okay, this is why we're calling it login attempt cache. And then here we're gonna define or initialize the cache. Okay, so the way we do that is just by writing this code that you see here. So what we're doing here to define this cache, which is coming from loading cache, and loading cache is coming from Google. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. Now, the way we initialize it is just by calling the cache builder and then call new builder on it, and then pass in some parameters. In this case, we're passing in the number of minutes after which we want it, or the time after which we want the cache to expire. In this case, it's 15 minutes. And then we're saying we want to have a maximum size for the cache, which is going to be 100. So at any given time in the cache, it can only support 100 entries. Okay, and this is this number, and this number is going to be something you're going to have to define depending on your security needs. And then after that, I defined some 3 methods down there. So the first one is going to remove an entry in the cache. Okay, because I no longer want to keep this user in the cache. Maybe they provided the correct password, so I need to remove them from the cache. And I call it evic user from login attempt cache. Okay, and here I pass in the username, and then I just call invalidate on this method right here. Okay, from the cache you call invalidate, and you pass in the key. Okay, as you can see, we define our key as a string and then the value as an integer. And then we have another method to add the user in the cache. And here all we're doing is we're taking the key again so that we can find the value, and then we're adding this user into the cache. But before we do, we increment their number of attempts, because we know if we're adding them to the login cache, that means they fail to log in. So we have to increment their number of attempts. And the way we do this is just by calling the cache and passing in the key, which in this case is the username. So it's going to return the value, which is going to be a number. like this, okay? Because that's how we define it up here. And then we're just gonna add 1 to that number, as you can see I'm doing here. And then once we do that, then we can pass in this number of attempt into the cache by putting it into the cache with the key and the value. And then lastly, we're just checking to see that if they have not exceeded the number of time we're allowing them to try to log in. And in this case, that's going to be 5. And all we're doing here is we try to get the actual value again by passing in the key again, key value. So when we call get, we pass in the key, it's going to return a number. Okay, it's going to return a number of attempt, which is going to be a number here, as you can see. And then we're going to check to see for that username, which is the key, if the number that we got, which is going to be the number of attempts, is equal or greater than 5, which we'll define here. If that's the case, then it's going to be false. Otherwise, it's going to be true, because that's going to be less than 5. So once I start using this, you're going to see how it's all going to come together. So maybe now it's not making a lot of sense, but once I start using it, then it'll make more sense.